So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker to open today's forum. And that's Rachel Siewert, who was a former Senator and Chair of the Community Affairs Inquiry into Grandparent Carers. So Rachel certainly brings a depth of experience and insight into what the issues are that are facing families who are living in kinship care arrangements at the moment. So I'd very much like to warmly welcome Rachel to our forum.
Thank you and good morning. It's even earlier over here. It's not quite as early as in the UK, but it's still pretty early here in Western Australia. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm on Wajak Noongar Uja, and I acknowledge that in this country we have a lot of unfinished business. I was chair of the Senate inquiry into grandparents raising grandchildren. Now that reported on the end of October in 2014, and there are a number of the recommendations that are, I would suggest, out of date. But I think it's still important to revisit those recommendations and see and to assist the discussions today. I intend to talk for a little while. You'll get sick of my voice, so then I'll go to questions. What I wanted to first cover was the sorts of issues that came out of the inquiry. And I'll preface this by saying that one of the benefits of Senate inquiries is that it opens the Parliament to hear people's lived experience. And that is so important, particularly for grandparent carers who are, as we know, often marginalised. They're too busy looking after their grandchildren. Up until that point, they hadn't been getting a lot of attention at the national level. And I don't think it would have come as a surprise to grandparents and those that are working with grandparent carers, the nature of the issues. But I think it did come as a surprise to some of the members of the committee and also to the Senate when we reported our findings. And of course, we found that grandparents are overwhelming, who are caring for their grandchildren, are overwhelming living in poverty. That they're older, they often start looking after their grandchildren under emergency and crisis situations. That First Nations peoples, and it's particularly important that we've acknowledged traditional owners, because First Nations grandparents are also doing it particularly tough, and there is a lack of trust from First Nations grandparents with the system. And in fact, just last week I was talking to a grandparent, or to a Noongar grandparent carer, grandmother, who had a little while ago been looking after her grandchild, and she reiterated the trouble with engaging with the State Department and the lack of trust that they had in the State Department. And I've heard that repeatedly. And it's not just, of course, here in Western Australia, it's where I'm obviously from, it's across the country. We also heard that there's more and more children going into the care of their grandparents, and that they're going in with significant trauma, that they have increasing numbers have going into the care of their grandparents with a disability, and that these issues aren't being recognised. We also heard that it affects relationships between grandparent carers and can put a lot of strain on the family. And in fact, overwhelmingly, it's grandmothers that are taking responsibility for their grandchildren. We identified the fact there's a very complicated system to navigate, and it continues to be so, and I'll come back to that. We heard about the issues about being sent off to IT and the lack of technical skills in some cases for some grandparents. Particularly, we also heard about the difficulties with Medicare, with family tax, accessing family tax benefit, and I'll come back to that. There's We also heard about the issues around access to education and difficulties with the education system. Also, the activity requirements and mutual obligations. And I could talk under wet cement about that, the failures of that system. As I've said, people are finding the system complicated, and I'll come back to where to from here and some of the progress or lack thereof in a minute. The other key thing was the issue around formal versus informal carers, and overwhelmingly grandparent carers were caring for their grandchildren in the informal settings, which also at a Commonwealth and also in some states makes that hard to access assistance and some of the grants, etc. And the issue also is the interaction between the state and territory systems and the Commonwealth system. I'd like to go to the recommendations or the government's response to the recommendations. So we had 18 recommendations, and what I'll do is go through them and how the government responded. Now, the government responded on the 29th, oh no, sorry, it was the 15th of January 2016. So in other words, you know, around not quite 18 months after the recommendations were tabled. For me, that's a long time, but in terms of the Senate process, some reports don't get a response for 2 or 3 years after the fact, even though the government is supposed to respond within 6 months of a report being tabled in the Senate. In my opinion, the government's response was pretty lacklustre. They always had excuses for not doing things or palming things off onto the state governments. They noted things, or in a couple of cases flat out didn't support some things. Now, overwhelming, a number of the really important recommendations were in fact palmed off to the state and territories, or the government claimed that they were already doing things. Now, in terms of, for example, setting up a subcommittee of the Older Australians Working Group to ensure, which is part of recommendation 1's, folks, the government responded and said, well, we don't think there's a need for a subcommittee, you know, people are interested in these issues. I was deeply concerned that was the government response, given that there are so many issues to address with grandparent carers. The current system isn't working, and that's why that part of that recommendation was made, so that more focus could be put on grandparent carers. The government's response was also around working, I should also preference that the report references the Department of Human Services, and of course that's now Services Australia, and Centrelink and Services Australia are essentially all part of. So Centrelink is part of Services Australia, but it's also now part of the Department of Social Services. And they also said in their response was, and I'd be really interested to hear other people's involvement with, well, what is now Services Australia and the Department of Social Services. And unfortunately, these organisations do not collaborate well together. And I found that very clearly during the pandemic. So I think the government in itself, the federal government in and of itself, has a long way to go in terms of sharing information between, for example, Services Australia, the Department of Social Services, and particularly the Department of Employment. We also talked about the need for there to be ways to improve the way we identify grandparent carers in the process. There has been some progress there. I wouldn't say it's gone far enough, because we are still having problems with, for example, family tax benefit. And I wrote, would have been towards the beginning of this year, to the Minister and Ruston, again raising the issue of access to, or timely access to, family tax benefit. And I was told, oh, it follows the child, it's fine. But I continually hear from grandparent carers that in fact they are having trouble accessing family tax benefit. So there's still issues that we need to address there. Got to say the same goes for Medicare. I've still had concerns raised with us and with me about access to Medicare for grandchildren in care. I was also concerned about the fact that recommendation 4, sorry, won't go through every single one, but again, this one is the one that talked about access to legal services. That was a huge issue that came up during the Senate inquiry, is that grandparent carers found it very difficult to get access to legal services, and I think the government's response was basically, again, lacklustre, didn't add value to and didn't pick up the intent of what we were saying, is that grandparents need better access to legal services. It went through the sorts of legal services that are currently available that, in fact, aren't, we heard directly from grandparent carers that those services aren't directly available. Then some work in terms of the National Survey of Non-Parent Carers. AFE has started to put, and has got on their website now, information for grandparent carers, but it talks about a lot of their work, and the survey that AFE undertook was about non-parental carers and didn't overly focus on grandparent carers in and of itself. In terms then of, sorry, I should go to grandparent advisors. There was a review done in 2017 that nobody will be shocked to learn said, yeah, grandparent advisors in Centrelink are really helpful. And they had increased them from 6 to 8. I, wearing my previous hat as a senator, frequently got complaints about people not being able to get, timely access to the grandparent advisors, although people did find, when they did have access, found them helpful in the response that I got. In terms of funding, there's a mismatch, and in terms of recommendations 10, 11, 12, in terms of access to better funding and support services and respite, it was pushed back to the states and territories. So that means that people have to lobby each state and territory, and it varies across the country and still isn't adequate. They also push back on the issues around needing better support for First Nations grandparent carers, said, we have the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which quite frankly is poorly designed program, and it doesn't provide the sort of supports that are needed. And the government refers to their early childhood services, again, simply not enough. The issue around education was particularly important. We got evidence on that, and again, government's response to that was pretty poor. I will acknowledge that a number of the recommendations are now out of date, and I'd suggest that there's a need to go back to government and ask them to relook at those recommendations and maybe see if you think it's worthwhile doing some further consultation. The issues around family law, of course, go together with the legal services, and again, there was a lot of concern raised about access to the family law system and access to legal services. The bottom line here is that I'm just checking the time, for grandparent carers, they're overwhelmingly living in poverty, as I touched on this morning, which means that they need better access to financial resources. That's absolutely critical. They also, for example, need access to better accommodation. They need the sorts of financial assistance they need to be beyond, you know, the $400 grants, the $600 grants. That doesn't cut it. I know that the grandparent carers can now get access to the childcare, you know, greater childcare subsidy. Again, that's helpful, but it doesn't fill the needs, in my opinion, for what grandparents carers need. I think that the issue around, we also have a recommendation there about access to counselling and trauma. Now, that counselling and access to better support services needs to be, of course, available for the child, who we know, because of the complexity of the issues, what we heard during the inquiry, complexity of the issues that grandparent carers are facing now with their grandchildren, greater level of trauma. We heard that overwhelmingly there's been a really significant increase in the number of grandchildren going into grandparent care as a result of drug and alcohol abuse and use. And that has frequently meant that children have been subject to a high degree of trauma that is not being adequately, while you hear the mouthing of the words saying, yes, we understand that, there's not access to adequate services, counselling services, and that goes for grandparent carers as well, who are dealing with and have, by the time the grandchildren come into their care, what we heard was they'd been through a great deal of, or very often had been through a great deal of trauma, dealing with the family crisis as it had in the first place before the grandchildren came into their care. They are traumatised and the children are traumatised, and there's not enough access to services in there, and that again is frequently pushed back to the state and territories from the Commonwealth. The report talks about COAG. Of course, COAG no longer exists, and we are in this sort of no person's land to a certain extent because of National Cabinet, and now where the committees are just getting back up and running again. There needs to be greater coordination between the state and territories on this issue. I think I'll leave it there because I've just gone over the couple of minutes over what I said I would do, and then leave it for questions. So I'll throw back to the chair, and very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Just a reminder to people, if you use the Q&A button that's either on the top or bottom of your screen, you can start sending in questions or comments, and Tom Alsop from PCare will be collecting those up and looking at particular themes. But Rachel, there's a question I'd like to ask you about. You highlighted really the extent to which families in kinship care arrangements are falling between the cracks between federal and state and territory government responsibilities. One of the things that I keep talking to the Queensland Minister about, and the Shadow Minister, is this issue really. At the moment in Queensland, at the moment the estimates are we have about 4 times the number of children living in informal kinship care arrangements than formal kinship care arrangements.
Yeah.
So that means in Queensland, it's up to around 20,000 children living in informal kinship care arrangements. So that's nearly twice as many children that exist in the care of the state.
Yep.
So I guess I keep impressing upon the Minister and Shadow Minister that if these systems fail, if the extent to which these families are able to continue on with the challenges of these roles, not only financial, but as you highlighted, some of the trauma that children have experienced in these circumstances, there's a relative tsunami of children ready to crash into the formal statutory care system. But is there an answer to this? Like what can happen to ensure that federal and state and territory governments will collaborate and come up with a sensible arrangement where these families do not fall between the cracks any longer?
That's a really good question, a very complex one, because arrangements, of course, vary around the country. I think here in WA, 77% of children grandparent caring are in grandparent carers and the children are in informal care. So again, very high. I think it's the same around the country. For a start, I think it needs to be the issue needs to go very firmly on National Cabinet's agenda. And the problem is, because of COVID, a lot of these issues have actually fallen by the wayside in terms of up the priorities. But when you think about it, during COVID, grandparent carers, and during the pandemic, grandparent carers are under even more stress. They don't have access. In fact, I talked to some grandparent carers, and it was actually the beginning of this year, sorry, I think it was. And they were sort of telling me about the fact that they just couldn't get access to IT, for example. They couldn't get access to satisfactory access to iPads, and they also felt inadequate to support their grandchild or grandchildren in many instances for their tech needs, for example. So the situation, in my opinion, has got worse over the last, will have got worse, and that's what I'm hearing, over the last 18 months. So I think we need to go back to all the ministers and nag them to put it back on National Cabinet and get it as an issue of significance there. It's fairly, I will very clearly acknowledge that it fell in, there's a parliamentary friends of group that we started for grandparent carers, and it again, because of COVID, many of us that were involved in that group are also involved in issues around COVID at the federal level and in Parliament. But I think it's time to reactivate the grandparent carers group. And Dean Smith, as I'm sure many of the people participating today know, is a senator from Western Australia, and he's very passionate also about grandparent carers. And Carol Brown, I was one of the conveners. There's usually conveners across the Parliament. So usually it's a Green, a government person, and in this instance, a Liberal person for government, and Labor. So Carol Brown from Tasmania, also passionate about carers, is the other co-convener, and I don't think the Greens have reappointed my replacement, but I think it would be a good idea to get that group up, reinvigorate that group. And I was talking to, or both Dean and myself were talking to a Wansley about that earlier, at the end of this year, end of last year, beginning of this year. And again, because of the pandemic, it's one of those issues that you try and get some momentum, but COVID has overtaken it. But I do think, and of course, there's not been that many politicians in Parliament. So I do think there needs to be a concerted effort. And one of the things that we were talking about is having a national group focused just on grandparent carers. And I think in terms of from a non-government perspective, I actually think that's a very good idea. And the problem is Katrina got herself elected from Wansley, got herself elected to Parliament. And I think there hasn't been that impetus to drive it quite so much. So I think that would be an excellent way of driving the agenda.
Good. Well, we are hearing from Wansley a bit later on, and some of those other states you mentioned are well represented on this forum. So that's very handy tips for us as we coordinate and collaborate with our colleagues from other states as well. We have got a question. I'll just let Tom ask a question that came in through the chat line.
Rachel, we have a question from Julie Ling. She's asked, with the growth of older women experiencing homelessness, is this a high risk to grandparent informal care system?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I would say very strongly, yes. And that is an issue that is very firmly on both the NGO sector and, of course, a number of politicians' agenda. It is particularly, it's very deeply concerning. And I would say, yes, it is very strongly. If you've got older women who are becoming homeless, and I won't repeat all the circumstances, I'm sure people participating know them, I would say, yes, very strongly it is. And that issue needs to be addressed as well if we're going to be properly addressing support for grandparent carers.
Wonderful. Now, we don't have any other questions yet. Does anyone else from the audience have a question they'd like to put to Rachel? I'll give you a few moments.
While we're waiting, the other important issue that I think you highlighted was, well, two. One, we were very interested in what you had to say about education and the impact for education. And we'll hear from another speaker a bit later today about some of the concerns that relative carers have around maintaining the support to children and in education systems and their involvement in education systems. But the other part to that that has some relevance to that too is the impact of COVID, and that speaker's also going to highlight some of the issues that COVID has placed on relative carers. So in some ways, those issues were already there, but what COVID has done is bring them to the fore.
It's exacerbated them. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and it's made, of course, respite even harder for those that can access respite, and that's questionable in different states and territories. It also, of course, made that even harder.
We've had a question come in. I'm just asking, Rachel, could you please elaborate on the comment you made about the national group focused just on grandparent carers outside of Parliament?
Oh, okay. So what there had been some, and Wansley probably will be able to fill you in a bit more, but what the discussion, it was towards the end of last year, beginning of this year, was that there may be some momentum, or looking at the possibility of getting some momentum behind getting a peak or a collaboration between organisations working on grandparent carers to focus on advocacy and the grandparent carers agenda. And I'm fully aware there's a whole range of other carers, carers for there's young carers, for example. I know they're very important, but there was talk about getting or the possibility of getting a collaboration at a national level to push the national agenda and share experiences, agree on an agenda. What are the priorities? What needs fixing to drive that from a national agenda? But then, of course, that can be a two-way process. It can go back to share experiences across the states. So that was, I understand, something that Katrina from Wansley was very keen on. But yeah, she's now got herself elected. So I'm not sure where that's up to. Wansley might be able to tell you a bit later today.
We would support that. So I guess the child protection peaks from across the country really support the establishment of a peak or a similar body to a peak body, but a national one for relative carers. We would support that strongly. So we're keen to pursue some advocacy around that with our colleagues from other states.
I think that's really important, because when you look at some of the websites, some of the materials that are available for carers, it's all, a lot of it is really good, but frequently the special issues around grandparent carers don't get a look in and don't really get a mention, or not given adequate attention. And the government keeps brushing them off. Like I said, with the family tax benefit, I keep getting told it's not, for some people it's not working. And the government keeps coming back saying, well, yes, it is. Now, if we had a focused effort lobbying nationally, we could keep the pressure on the government to fix it, for example.
Yes. I mean, one of the issues that we've also discussed and that previously is that they're not really counted. These arrangements aren't counted in the census.
Yes.
And you might take a cynical view, well, it's in the government's interest in some ways that they're not counted, because then the problem can remain hidden. So as a first step, we'd certainly like these arrangements to be counted in the census, and make the problem not hidden any longer.
Exactly. And that's something we included in our recommendation. So I actually went to the ABS website and started having a little bit of a look, because the response to the recommendation that we made, that the committee made, was that, it's too late for the 2016 census, even though we reported in 2014, the government said it was too late for 2016 census. So I went to the ABS website to look at, well, what have they been doing? And they give, it blows my mind. It gives this complicated explanation about how you might be able to use some of the data to find out whether there's grandparent carers. Instead of just asking straight up the question, it's this complicated matrix about how you could maybe find out, but it wouldn't give you I don't think the way they describe it would give an accurate reflection on the number of grandparent carers.
Good. Well, thank you very, very much, Rachel. And you've set the scene for a very good day, I'm sure. So thank you very, very much for all your insight and your contribution to the forum. And hoping you can stay on and listen to what other people have to say. We've now got more questions coming in for you as well. So we'll see what we can do, but we might talk to you further about answering some of those as well.
I'm very happy to do that, and I would love to stay, but I've got to go to a Mental Health Commission forum here that's in fact starting in about 15 minutes. So I apologise. I would very much like to have stayed and heard because the program looks extremely interesting.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.